Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining Cadio's webinar series today. We are so happy to be joined by Karey O'Hara. Karey L. O'Hara is an assistant professor of psychology at Arizona State University. She conducts research on risk and protective factors that influence how children and parents adjust after stressful events in the family, such as parental divorce, bereavement, and incarceration. Currently, her research focuses on designing, optimizing, and evaluating interventions to promote the health and well-being of children who experience these challenging family stressors. Her work is currently funded by a Career Development Award from the National Institute of Mental Health. So thank you again, Karey, for being here.
Thank you, Jillian. I'm really excited to be here. I love being in a room with other people who are just as excited about intervention optimization as me. So thank you for, thank you for everyone joining today. I am looking forward to talking to you a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing recently on really thinking carefully about how MOST is truly an implementation forward approach to developing interventions and what that has looked like or meant for what's that meant for my work. So first, I just want to start with a quick story about how I was introduced to intervention optimization at what I felt like was just the right time in my career. So at that time, I was a postdoc. I was in a postdoctoral fellowship at Arizona State, and I was writing an application for a Career Development Award. And at the time, I felt very strongly about two things. First, I wanted to develop interventions for children who face extremely stressful events in their life. The hope of preventing these predictable adverse outcomes that we know often or can follow adverse childhood experiences. I had, during graduate school, I'd worked as a clinician, primarily focused on treating trauma, and time again, I found myself thinking, I wish I had had the chance to intervene with this family before things got so bad. That really brought me to prevention science. The second thing is that I did not want to spend years of my life developing and testing interventions that no one would use. At the time, I was being trained by two brilliant prevention scientists who had worked tirelessly for 40 years to develop and demonstrate through multiple randomized trials that a 10-week parenting intervention could protect children from a whole host of negative outcomes up to 15 years after their parents divorced or separated. It's pretty amazing from a science perspective. Yet, despite the 5 million family court cases that are filed annually in this country alone, less than 40 families per year were receiving this intervention. Needless to say, I found that pretty discouraging, especially as I set out to be an intervention developer and prevention scientist myself. So as I was writing that Career Development Award application, I was growing really excited about the potential of this new intervention I was going to develop, but there was that nagging thought in the back of my mind that said basically, like, who cares how amazing it could be if it never reaches the children that it is designed to help. I knew that I could make an intervention based on the very best science available, but I also knew that even the best intervention is basically useless if it's not used, if it never makes it to the real world. And so luckily at that time, I either, I had two choices: to go forth with this, figure out a way to make an intervention that was going to be used, or quit and do something else, I guess. But I stumbled upon Linda's work on intervention optimization, and this approach immediately just made so much sense to me. It felt in that moment like a guidebook that I needed, because it didn't compromise in any way on the rigorous science that I wanted to conduct, but it also just really, in a refreshing way, explicitly states the harsh reality that I knew, that we cannot impact public health if our interventions are not effective, affordable, efficient, and scalable. So since that time, I've submitted and was awarded that Career Development Award, and I've been studying and using MOST to develop interventions ever since. And I like some others that I know, have gotten really excited about the more recent focus on the intersection between intervention optimization and implementation science. Although actually I have to say, I actually think of it less as an intersection of two fields and more as this just explicit acknowledgement that in reality, they're one and the same. An optimized intervention is one that is inherently implementable. So today I'm going to talk with you about two of my favorite topics most, and human-centered design. A theme throughout all of my work is a focus on community partnerships. Basically, the way that I see it is that solving real-world problems requires this sort of blending, of skills and expertise. So I bring research design, data analysis skills, clinical expertise, but I don't work in the communities that where my interventions will ultimately live. I'm an academic, right? And so sure, I can suggest in theory, or I can think of, in theory, what would be the solution to a problem, but I know I don't have the knowledge that I need to know the ins and outs of the real world settings that are really going to determine whether a solution is going to translate from theory to reality. And so I develop and design interventions in collaboration with my community partners, because I think that that's going to give it the best chance of actually making it and working in the real world once the research is done. And so there's lots of ways to do this. I have adopted human-centered design as my sort of guiding framework. So I am here to argue that most is an implementation forward approach to intervention optimization, meaning that researchers using most identify implementation determinants at the outset and then consider them throughout the intervention development process. Maybe not explicitly, but I think that this is happening, and there's a way for us to think more specifically and explicitly about how we're doing this. So we know that there exists many intervention determinants, all of the barriers and facilitators of getting an intervention into an implementation setting. And we know, there's lots of those variables that impact whether or not it's going to be implementable. But in this presentation, I want to talk about the intervention itself as an implementation determinant, because it often gets overlooked. But it's something that I have found to be a really useful to think about. So human-centered design, so thinking about intervention design as an implementation determinant itself, and then that has led me to think about how human-centered design, which is an interdisciplinary field, it's been around for a long time, but it's really only the last 10 years or so that psychosocial intervention developers have really started to consider the design of the actual program from the perspective, well, one, at all, right? And two, from the design of the intervention, or from the perspective of the folks who it's intended to serve, or whoever's going to use it. So many of you probably have seen the pages and pages long manuals that we have, and we just, for a long time, we're saying, just implement it with high fidelity. Here's the manual, but they were not always highly usable or designed in a way that that would facilitate that implementation with fidelity nonetheless. So this has really been an area of our field that has gotten my interest and that of others to think about how are we designing our interventions from the ground up so that they are highly usable, so that they're acceptable, so that they're contextually appropriate. And the way to that, and human-centered design gives us a set of methods in order to do that, to really design from the perspective of the individual who the intervention is intended to serve, as opposed to from what we think is the best design as academics or intervention developers. Oops. There we go. Okay. So you all probably would agree that we know intervention design really starts in the preparation phase. And we don't always think explicitly about it, but it certainly does. And so that's where I'm going to focus today. I know I have some preparation phase fans here today, but I also know that one of the things that makes preparation phase work sometimes challenging for people, especially those new to the MOST framework, I certainly experienced this, is that compared to the other phases of MOST, there's less guidance on the how or the methods that you can use to complete preparation phase activities or achieve those objectives. Preparation activities, at least as I've seen so far, tend to be more researcher or project specific. And so most So some most aligned investigators find themselves a little bit lost in terms of how to begin. But we also all know that the information gathered in the preparation phase is so critically important because it lays the foundation for the entire process. Right? So for the rest of the time, our time together, I'm going to walk you through a proposed synthesis of a most and human-centered design model that my colleagues and I recently wrote about as part of a special collection in intervention optimization and implementation research and practice. And my goal by the end is to convince you that a human-centered design framework known as the DDBT model, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, is an option for us if we're really looking for a theory-driven and a methods-rich sort of roadmap for achieving the goals of the preparation phase most. Oh, and I also want to say, it was on my first slide, but my co-first author on this paper, Dr. Lindsay Knowles, developed the first version of many of these slides, so I wanted to acknowledge her work in that. Okay, so bird's eye view of the two frameworks you know most. Let's talk about DDBT. So DDBT stands for the Discover, Design, Build, and Test framework, and it's really rooted in human-centered design principles and strategies. It was introduced by Aaron Lyon and his colleagues at the University of Washington as a framework to study and improve the usability of interventions, or in my case, when I think about it, intervention components, as a key determinant of intervention implementation. So usability in this framework is defined as the degree to which the individuals for whom an intervention is designed to serve can accomplish whatever goals it is that we want them to achieve during that intervention easily, effectively, and efficiently in a satisfactory manner, whatever the specific context it is. So easy to use is a shorthand, but usability is sort of the main focus of DDBT. And you can think of it as DDBT is this sort of blend of human-centered design and implementation science. And one way to think about it is that the core implementation determinant that it's addressing is the usability of the intervention, or how user-friendly is the design of the thing that you have developed. So DDBT is a three-phase model. Like I said, it combines the principles of human-centered design, implementation science, and the way that I see it is that it can help us sort of systematically design intervention components themselves, which then will go on to be subjected to experimentation in optimization and evaluation phases as a package. So the overall goal, like I said, maximize usability and for the sole purpose of maximizing implementation outcomes. And this can be used for novel or redesigned interventions. It was originally developed more with redesigning interventions in mind, but I think maybe we should just use it from the beginning so that we don't have to then go redesign, save us some time. So that's how I think about it. So before I dive into the details of DDBT, I just want to highlight why I think, and my colleagues think, that these two approaches are so complementary. So first, DDBT and MOST are both systematic phased iterative approaches to intervention development. They're problem agnostic. They're suitable for any complex psychosocial, behavioral, public health intervention, or implementation strategy. And they both share the goal of designing interventions to have maximum public health impact. They also both explicitly balance effectiveness of the solution, with intervention level implementation determinants. Like in MOST, we're thinking about affordability, scalability, efficiency. In DDBT, we're thinking about usability, which there's some overlap there as well. There's certainly correlated concepts. And then the third is that both models have room to really emphasize the critical roles of engaging stakeholders, intervention gatekeepers, intervention users, beneficiaries of the intervention process, however we think about that. In most, this is most easily seen in the optimization objective, and in DDBT, there's this explicit focus on incorporating end users and stakeholders in the research process. So I want to turn a little bit to show you why we propose that we think that DDBT is an excellent framework to sort of help researchers accomplish the goals of preparation phase. We also think it can be useful in other phases, but that for the focus of time and just sort of thinking through these ideas, we focus on preparation. So here's a figure to orient us. You can kind of see the outline of the most framework, and then how DDBT can be embedded within the preparation phase to meet those goals. So to illustrate, I'm going to walk you through kind of what this might look like. And to do that, I'm going to use an example project, which is the focus of my career development award. This is a project where I have applied this sort of synthesized DDBT and MOST approach to develop a digital intervention for children ages 9 to 12 who are experiencing high levels of interparental conflict following parental separation or divorce. So we'll keep coming back to that. So the first phase of DDBT framework is discover. And when we think about the discover phase, the purpose of it is really to discover what is our target for designing or redesigning interventions. So from the very beginning, like what should this look like? When it's, this is the sort of dreaming it up phase. And from a DDBT perspective, you really want to understand the intervention and its context, and think about its hypothesized mechanisms or targets, because the idea, right, is that we want to use design as a way to have the program work in the way that we want it to work, the intervention to work. An important activity in this phase is to identify the different needs and points of view of stakeholders involved, and then also to clarify usability issues or other barriers to implementation, like maybe there's a cost cap, for example. So you're probably thinking this is reminding you of an optimization objective, which certainly is certainly a key objective of the preparation phase. So I have the key objectives of the preparation phase up in the top right hand of the screen, and I'll keep that there so you can kind of see how, as we go through DDBT, it's really mapping on to those ultimate objectives. So the way that we're thinking about it is that Discover is really focused on helping you figure out your conceptual model. So either designing or revising your conceptual model, thinking about, the hypothesized mechanisms, targets, those sorts of things, what they might look like, how they're hypothesized to impact one another, work together in terms of main and interactive effects. And then really identifying the optimization objective. I think this is a huge one, where using DDBT and in the discover phase, the sort of suite of methods or strategies that we can borrow from human-centered design to identify the optimization objective in a way that is rigorous and standardized, and kind of leads you through a process of gathering information and then synthesizing that from your stakeholders. And again, really thinking carefully about, okay, what's going to happen? I always think about, in one of our first meetings together, Linda, you said to me, well, who's going to pay for it? And, most of us don't think about that. I do now, for sure. But really upfront, what are the barriers? Who's going to pay for this, for example? So this is really the work of the first phase of DDBT that can help us get to that conceptual model and really identify our optimization objective. So I want to just, so I'll bring you back to our example project. So when we first started in the discover or preparation phase, really focusing on the conceptual model, the first thing that I did was starting to review my own and others' empirical work on sort of the underlying processes that I really wanted to intervene upon. If I took a big step back and I thought, well, I'm trying to make sure that children have better outcomes in this context, and I want a program to do that, what's happening, like what goes on, why do kids have bad outcomes in the first place, what's happening between their exposure to conflict and their outcomes that that we can identify as sort of a causal process and intervene upon. So started with, you know, a theory model that probably looks familiar to many of you. And then really getting it to in the form of a conceptual model to map out exactly what I expected each component of this intervention to do. So the way that I did that using human-centered design, or the DDDP framework, was really this discover phase, qualitative data analysis, data collection and analysis. So we used a human-centered design approach. We did qualitative interviews with stakeholders that represented different end users of the intervention. So we define that as family law professionals, including mental health professionals, attorneys, judges, divorcing parents, and children. So you might think that while it's the kids, we're developing this intervention for kids, so they're the end users, and that's true, but we also knew that an intervention like this is not going to reach children if it doesn't also garner the support of parents, that courts will want to adopt it, that providers are going to refer to it, and that kids are going to enjoy. So we're thinking about implementation, like what's the process of implementation? What has to happen in order for a child to sit down at a computer, open up our intervention, and go through it? And so we really took this human-centered design approach by sitting back and thinking about who are all the people that are going to play a role in this process. And so that is how we set up our preparation phase research to answer our questions about optimization objectives. Oh, sorry, I should tell you what we found. So we used, so like I said, we conducted these qualitative interviews with 47 individuals. We were really looking at what they wanted the intervention to, what they thought it needed to do, what it needed to look like, but also more practical issues like who's going to pay for it, and what's going to have to happen in order, for example, for courts to adopt this. What are things that I'm not thinking about because I don't spend my day in family court, all my days in family court, although I do spend a lot of time there, but you know, that I don't know the process in and out, but what has to happen? Like, for example, can judges order kids to take this program? They can order parents to take a program. What about kids? Well, turns out the answer to that is it depends. But it really started helping us think in the very beginning about not only what are the things that we need to know in order to design an intervention from the very beginning. Like, for example, we learned that our intervention, the design of our intervention and the content actually had to meet certain statutory guidelines, or it would not be able to be adopted by family courts. And so you can imagine if we would have found that out after the fact, we would be doing a lot of backtracking to add those characteristics to an intervention, which then, you know, brings us back to the beginning. So this was really important information for us to know ahead of time. Our interview questions assessed cost, how long could it be, how long, you know, the duration, who would be the facilitators, and what would be the barriers to implementation? Where could it possibly, like, how would it actually get to the kids? Those sorts of things. What kinds of decisions are family courts, what factors are they considering when they're deciding whether or not to adopt an intervention? How do we make sure that parents aren't going to get in the way, or not support their children participating? So all of those things. And so based on all of that, we ended up with an optimization objective that we defined as the all active component. And the reason for that is that we found that basically parents said that they needed to be, that they thought that there could be up to, not parents, participants told us that they thought it could be up to 4 to 5 modules would be acceptable. That was pretty typical in terms of what interventions the court is typically referring families to, and they said that it needed to all be done for $50 or less. And so the way that we were from the outset, we're going to make it a digital intervention. We knew that we could include up to 5 components, and since we only have 3, 4 with a constant component, we knew we were sort of in the realm of possibility, and so we didn't have to think about that at the moment. But that helped us really set out to have an optimization objective from the beginning. So then we moved into the second phase, which is design and build. In this phase, we're thinking a lot about preparation phase activities or objectives of like identifying candidate components and conducting pilot tests. So the design and build phase, this is when, as researchers using a human-centered design approach, you're really iteratively developing, evaluating, refining prototypes of intervention components so that they meet the needs of the stakeholders, and then you can prioritize which ones are going to be candidate components and exactly how they're going to look. So built prototypes based on findings from our discover phase work, and then was able to really work together with representatives from that community in small samples using user testing sessions to make sure that those components that we were then going to subject to screening in our next phase were highly usable, that they were really addressing those intervention determinants that we had discovered before. So in design and build, there's a bit of an overlap in terms of the user testing methods that are used. So we're thinking about things like qualitative interviews, but it's often more you're moving into observational research, like having someone really like sit down with your intervention, get their hands on it, think aloud as they're moving through it, observing them using and interacting with your intervention. And the primary goal here is really to identify usability problems that we don't want to pop up later when we're doing our optimization evaluation, because then we don't know, is it the component itself that's not having the effect that we expected it to have, or is it because it's not usable or there's something wrong with the design of it that's really getting in the way. And so this is our chance to really address those as best that we can and really improve components, feasibility, acceptability, appropriateness, getting them ready for the screening experiment, essentially. So in our example project, we basically synthesized, larger findings from the stress and coping literature to identify coping strategies that were likely to be effective. But then we used a lot of our discover phase work to take those sort of principles and design them in a way that was specific for this population. So we decided on 3 candidate intervention components where we would teach, and these intervention components are all content components. And so one is teaching the skill of reappraisal, teaching the skill of distraction coping, and teaching the skill of relaxation coping. These are all coping strategies that are related to fewer mental health problems among children. In the larger literature, they're evidence-based strategies, and they also are ones that were coming up in our qualitative work. And so it was a nice blend of addressing what the stakeholders wanted to see in the intervention and relying on the empirical literature to define components that we thought had the best chance of working in the way that we thought that they would, and having the effects that we laid out in our conceptual model. And so during this phase, we were really designing them. I mean, and we're talking about building, writing out storyboards, showing those to professionals, really this iterative process of trying, well, what if we introduce relaxation in this way? Is that going to get our point across? And is it also going to be something that kids find engaging and fun? So we developed these 4 modules. We have a psychoeducation module, which is a constant component. And that was really important because it addressed a lot of the feedback that we got in the qualitative in the qualitative work that we did, but things that didn't really lend themselves well to be tested as a standalone component, for example. So the constant provides basic education about divorce, brain, sort of science-based explanations about the connections among thoughts, feelings, and actions, and really designed it to maximize engagement for these kids. And then each candidate component was designed to teach one coping skill. Based on that conceptual model, we expected that when they learned the coping skill and had chances to practice using it, it would in turn decrease their maladaptive responses during conflict events. So what we did is we designed the first two initial modules as prototypes, the constant component and then one of the skills modules. And we did work like we did a user design survey, for example. We had kids help us pick out the characters for the games, name the characters, those sorts of things. We did a lot of like seat testing to make sure that it would meet that design criterion of 30 minutes or less that we were going for. We had to cut content to meet that seat time, but we knew that was our, that was part of our optimization objective, that we needed to have, they needed to be brief, they needed to be engaging, all of those things. And so we were using different methods to try to make sure that that's what we ended up with in terms of our end product. And then once we had the prototype, we did user testing sessions where we used a think aloud protocol. We directly observed parents, children, and professionals going through the modules, giving us qualitative and quantitative feedback to assess the usability and acceptability of the modules. They were interviewed on things like their overall impressions, anything that they found confusing or difficult. I mean, even as simple as like, I don't know where to click next, those sorts of things. The way that I think about it is we're just really trying to remove all of that all those extraneous factors that might get in the way of us really being able to see what the effect of this intervention component is. What they liked the most, what they liked the least, ideas for improvement, those sorts of things. And then we revised the components based on that feedback. So we had a lot of feedback, and we went through this process where we were basically trying to synthesize and then rank order and prioritize what we were gonna change at that time. We also put a lot of things on the wish list for when we had more money to make the components, like have animation, for example, or something like that. We couldn't do everything, but we tried to do as much as we could so that we could get these in the best condition possible for the screening experiment. Let's see. So that was our design and build. I'll just show you a little bit about the data that we collected. So we really were focused in this, thinking about conducting pilot tests. We were really focused on the usability of the components, the acceptability, the appropriateness, and the usefulness of these intervention components. And we got pretty good feedback. People said that the components themselves are pretty easy to follow, child-friendly, very straightforward. No, it wasn't confusing. They liked that there wasn't a lot of reading. So you can see that we used quantitative and qualitative methods to get a sense of this. Parents were talking about how they liked that it was a game format. I love this quote from this child. We asked them if it was fun or boring or something else, and they said, I think it's more in the middle. It's fun, but I'd rather be doing other things, which is fair. I really appreciated that honesty. We had comments about the graphics and the sort of surface level design features. We found our user testers found it very appropriate for the population. This child said for kids, if they're still sad or angry or thinking it was their fault, then definitely this is a good thing for them to do. And then in terms of usefulness, they talked about how, that we were teaching easy to remember, easy to use tools was a good thing that they liked. really kind of what came out here is that they liked the sort of strategies, that the skill building components. And then this was actually not part of my initial goals of assessing potential impact, but it just really struck me as I was going through these user testing sessions. I had more than one parent say something like, playing this game, when for the user testing, we asked them to sort of put themselves in the shoes of their child and pretend like they're a child going through this program. And this parent said, it brought me back to my childhood in an instant. If I would have had this telling me to take a breath and breathe, it's not about me, I could have reacted different, and maybe my childhood would have been different. This parent said, I thought that I was alone growing up. This made me feel good. You know, anyone that works in this area probably knows that there's a high incidence of parents who have also had similar experiences when they were children, and now they're the parents in the situation. But playing these games sort of just transported them back to those moments. This parent, this last one, was tearful, saying that, you know, I know it's just a game and I'm just pretending, but brought me back. Just playing that game. And so that's what we were trying to figure out. Are we getting it? You know, this is a game, we're making it fun and engaging, but is it also really resonating with people? And then the last part of DDBT is the test, which again falls under the preparation phase activity of conducting pilot tests. And so for this phase, we spend our time focusing on really refining, developing high quality prototypes of these components, and then conducting pilot testing to evaluate the usability, feasibility. Basically, we were trying to, most of what we were doing was really evaluating whether or not, you know, our randomization procedures were working, our red cap measures were reading the way that they were intended to. And so it was just with 10 kids, a real kind of pilot test of what our optimization RCT was planned to look like. And that was, I know everyone's done pilot tests, it's like you think you know how everything's going to work, and then you're really glad that you did. So that's what we did. And let's see here. Oops. Well, we have a sneak preview of it there, but we won't do that for now. So that's an example, basically, of how in my work we've been using this approach. It can, you know, it's just one example. And we also wanted to note, as we do in the paper, that we certainly recognize that DDBT is not the only framework for systematically achieving preparation phase activities. It is one of many. It is user-centered, but it also doesn't necessarily involve full sharing of power with users and participants like you would see in more of like a community-based participatory research approach. And I guess the way that we think about it really is that DDBT, we're hoping in this paper is an example of an overarching framework that really you can embed within the preparation phase to guide your activities, to really get focused on how are we going to achieve these preparation phase activities in a systematic, rigorous way, so that we can go into our optimization phase ready to conduct that screening experiment, and sort of cutting off the possibility or reducing the possibility that there's going to be these design features that are getting in our way and not allowing us to really get as much information as we can out of our optimization randomized controlled trial. So I think I'm gonna end that and just say, you know, this is our proposed approach of synthesized sort of DDBT and MOST approach. We think that it's a rigorous and efficient way to sort of center the user's voice, but also enhance in terms of getting to a design that's optimal for the intervention itself, but also enhancing sort of the rigor and the reproducibility of most preparation phase activities. That will then have hopefully downstream effects in the other phases of intervention optimization. So I just always love to end with a thank you to all my mentors, collaborators, funding sources. My community partners are incredible. I can't do any of this work without them. It wouldn't be impactful or even really feasible. And the kids and the parents that take their time to tell me about their experiences, which are typically not that much fun, but to help us kind of situate the science in the context of their lived experience, I think makes it much better and more impactful. So I will just end there.
Thank you so much, Karey. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and I see that there's one in the chat here that we can just kick off with. Shelley, would you like to ask it, or would you like me to read it from the chat? I don't know if you have a preference about that.
Yeah, I see it. I can read it.
Okay.
Shelley, it's a good question. I would say more
Karey,
than you think
can you read the question?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So Shelley asked about how much time do you recommend committing to preparation phase using DDBT? Do you expect it'll get quicker over time or stay about the same? So my first answer is more time than you think. Always, right? I spent, just to give you, this is a K award, so I'm learning. I do think it's going to get quicker over time, and in fact it is. I'm working on other projects and it is certainly going faster, but it took 3 to 4 times as long as I thought it would. We also had a pandemic that happened in the middle of that, so it's hard to know how much that impacted it, but just in general, I would commit more time. I'm happy to talk about my experience in more detail to give more specific recommendations. But yeah, it's not something that I think with any sort of community engaged work, things always move slow, always have a hard, because you're not on your own schedule.
That makes sense. And one follow-up question, Karey. So do you expect to apply the DDBT framework every time, or only for some projects and not others? Are there like best use cases versus scenarios where you feel like you wouldn't need it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I am using it in one form or another in all of the projects. So I don't know. I mean, I think, like I said, there's other frameworks. I just tend to like human-centered design. DDBT is a way to kind of map that out. So I think that I probably will keep doing that unless I find something I like better. But I think it's more important to just pick something to help guide your work than necessarily. I like user-centered design because of some of its, the philosophy and the features behind it, but I can see the argument for others, certainly. And so I think it's really just kind of figuring out what your main goals are.
Makes sense. All right, thanks.
Yeah. And I also think that you could use elements of human-centered design without, adopting the whole DDBT framework. So like, for example, maybe if you're doing like a training or like maybe a clinician checklist or something like that, maybe you want to make sure it's usable, but maybe it's not as involved as, developing an asynchronous module, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Karey.
Yeah.
Another question. Any grant writing lessons learned for pitching this type of methodology, framing, etc., especially at an early career /K level?
Yes. And we have that available in a webinar that I did with Rachel last year, I think. I'm happy to point people in that direction and share materials, but yeah, I have put together some lessons learned for a case specifically.
But I think big picture, right, Karey, would you agree that there's an advantage to using something like DDBT within the preparation phase, particularly in a career development grant, so that there's a clear systematic approach? Like, Can you talk a little bit about the grantsmanship
Yeah.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, exactly. It definitely gave me a framework to think through what exactly I was going to do for myself and with my mentors for sure. But I also think that it provided a structure for the readers. I think because preparation phase work is often so researcher and project specific that you're opening yourself up to easy criticism if you've got a reviewer that's like, well, I do it differently, and you don't have a reason for the way you're doing it, then that's a really sort of easy thing to criticize. So at least in this way, I sort of felt like, well, it might not be what the reviewer necessarily would do, but at least like I have, it's not just me being like, oh, I'm going to do this and then this because I think it sounds great. Put some structure around it and helped me build my argument, but I think it also, like from a process perspective and a planning perspective, but I think it also came across as more polished.
So the webinar that Karey mentioned was done with the optimization of behavioral and biobehavioral intervention special interest group, the OBBI SIG, which is a part of the Society for Behavioral Medicine. And there is a paywall for that webinar, but I'm sure if you reached out to Karey, she would love to share.
Yeah, I have a lot of PowerPoints and materials compiled. I'm happy to share with anybody who's in that position, writing, starting that journey.
I also have a question.
Okay, we all have questions. We can battle it out. How about you, Linda?
Right. So Karey, I'd like to ask you in my work with intervention scientists, and actually this is really for anyone who's on the webinar. In my work with intervention scientists, I very often find it that the preparation phase is a really tough sell. It's like they don't really want to do it to get people to come up with a conceptual model. It's like, yeah, I'll do that later. But let's brainstorm about components first. And that most people would rather make kind of a laundry list of components rather than do what seems to me to be a necessary first step, which is developing the conceptual model. And I know you're not like that, Karey, but I'm sure you've worked with people who are, and that's kind of a mystery to me. Can you just, if you guys can help me understand it, I can maybe do a better job dealing with it when I encounter it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I also want to know how to do that better because I think that's a conversation I have with people a lot. I've had the experience where people kind of, they buy into sort of the overall idea of optimization, but they don't go through the steps. Which is interesting to me because, I feel like a logic model seems to be easier to sell, which I know, they're different, but it's sort of the same, it's sort of similar purposes in terms of like, the first step. So
So you're saying well, let's start with a logic model might be helpful? Because for those of you who don't know the difference or aren't clear on the difference, the logic model is similar to a most conceptual model, but it usually doesn't specify which intervention components target which mediators. And that's a necessary part of the most conceptual model.
Well, one thing that I found difficult, I'm just kind of reflecting on my own process of developing a conceptual model. And this is why I think maybe starting with a logic model might help I think some people find the conceptual model pretty daunting because there's either I've seen one of two experiences. One where it's like, there's just like, I don't know, they don't know. I mean, we don't have a lot of, this is a perpetuating problem, right? We don't know how individual components operate. so they don't feel like, I think a lot of people don't feel like they really have like a literature to draw on. And so then they get a little bit uncomfortable with this, like, well, I'm just sort of making educated guesses kind of thing. Whereas like a logic model, it's easier to say, well, there's a correlation there. So I think that that path is well, represented or well supported. So I think there's that. And then the other thing that at least I found difficult, I don't know if others did, is that it was hard for me to sit back and think like, well, what if like do I think a component's really going to, like, getting very specific about your proximal outcomes? Because sometimes it's easy to say like, well, for example, in mine, I think that, in theory, reappraisal and distraction coping should both impact like psychological distress, for example. So then I really had to force myself to like get specific about what is the factor within that larger concept that we think this component is going to impact. And that, so maybe it's just kind of pushing people towards thinking more in a nuanced way that we're not used to. I don't know. I'd love to hear what others think.
Could I say that we have Dr. Kate Merrill, who is on as well, and she comes at this from a different approach where you're taking an existing intervention and then working toward optimizing that. And so Kate, your approach for developing a conceptual model is different, and maybe you have something to share.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. And in my case, since I have been working from an existing intervention, part of what was tricky is that the existing intervention, even though it was evidence-based, didn't actually really have like a logic model or conceptual framework that had been developed initially. So then I've worked a lot to try to come up with the conceptual framework for our study. But then like the level of detail, I think, that has to go into the conceptual framework, especially since you are identifying mediators, not only what are the mediators specific to each component, but trying to identify like your primary mediator, like ideally having one mediator per component. And, with an existing intervention, that part especially was difficult and involved a lot of conversations with the original intervention developer to try to understand, well, what were you thinking, with how you designed the intervention initially. So it's, I think that I sympathize that I think it's a challenging process going through the conceptual framework step, but it is so important. I completely agree. And because also with the optimization trial and, using the most framework, all comes back to that conceptual framework. So you want to feel really good that, okay, we do really think that this component might lead to this, or, but I don't have a lot of like suggestions on how to help other people realize the importance of it, because I've just come across similar challenges, I guess, with my work too.
We think we have time for one more question. Kate, you have a quick one?
So, I mean, it's kind of maybe a nice bridge from Kate's example. Karey and Lindsay, I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about how, the DDBT within the preparation phase of most could be used to optimize an existing intervention. So Karey, you gave a really nice example of like building from the ground up, but could you say anything about, optimizing something that already exists?
Yeah, Linz, do you want to speak to that? Because that's more in line with what you're doing.
Oh, I mean,
I didn't see you on here earlier. I don't know, but this is the brilliant Dr. Knowles that I alluded to earlier in terms of my co-first author and person who made the first version of these slides.
Yeah, happy to help. And I think just the quick thing I would add as we're at the end here, and great presentation of it, Karey, is just that, being able to use DDBT to optimize or to think about pilot testing within a certain setting. So adapting an existing intervention for a certain population or setting, I think is a really nice implementation forward way to think about how to use this for an existing intervention.
Well, thank you again, Dr. O'Hara, for joining us today and for your wonderful talk. And thank you everybody for being here with us. We hope that you will join us again on Wednesday, October 4th for our next webinar.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Karey.